The wind howled across the dry plains, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. In the distance, a lone figure rode slowly, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of sand as the sun began its descent behind jagged mountains. The ranch stretched wide and lonely, fences creaking in the breeze. A place where whispers of the past seemed to hang in the air like morning fog. This was no ordinary homestead. It had a reputation, one that the nearby townsfolk muttered about, but seldom approached. It was said that the rancher who owned this land was a man who trusted few, a solitary soul whose eyes seemed to see more than he ever spoke. On the other side of the frontier, a small group of travelers arrived at the edge of this harsh landscape. They were young women from a faraway land, their faces pale against the sun-worn leather of the American West. Their journey had been long, carried across rivers and plains that seemed endless. They had come seeking work, opportunity, or perhaps just a glimpse of the vast, untamed frontier they had heard about in stories. When they first caught sight of the lone rancher, their hearts raced not just from fatigue, but from a strange mix of curiosity and unease. He was unlike anyone they had ever met, tall, broad-shouldered, his sun-beaten hat pulled low over sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything and everyone in their path. From the moment he spoke, there was a tension that refused to fade. His voice was rough, edged with years of solitude. Yet there was a strange warmth beneath the surface that hinted at stories unspoken. He offered them a place to rest, a chance to stay on the ranch until the next town. But the way he watched them careful, calculating made them uneasy. They had grown up in a world where strangers often meant trouble, and this man, though seemingly quiet and polite, carried a weight of mystery that both fascinated and frightened them. The first evening on the ranch was quiet, almost painfully so. The wind whispered through the trees as if carrying secrets meant only for the rancher and the land itself. The women tried to make conversation, sharing small laughs and stories from their homeland, but every sound seemed to bounce off the wide, empty space around them. In the kitchen, the rancher moved with methodical precision, his actions simple but deliberate, chopping wood, tending a fire, checking supplies. There was a rhythm to his solitude, a pattern the women couldn't yet read. They watched him from the doorway, noticing the sharp angles of his face, the set of his jaw, the way he paused sometimes, as though listening for something far beyond the walls of the house. As night fell, the ranch seemed to transform. Shadows stretched across the wooden floors, and the moonlight fell in silver strips through the high windows. The women felt a chill not entirely from the cool night air. There was a sense of anticipation, of something about to unfold, though none of them could say what. The rancher had a habit of speaking in stories rather than answers, letting his hands do the talking while his words hinted at events long past. One of the women, the youngest of the group, leaned closer to the fire and asked about the history of the ranch. He paused, the edge of a smile appearing briefly, then began to speak. His tales were strange and captivating. He spoke of the land of cattle drives lost to storms, of nights when the coyotes howled like ghosts, and the desert seemed endless. He told them about travelers who had come seeking fortune and vanished, leaving only footprints in the dust. His voice was low, almost hypnotic, pulling them into a world far removed from the bustling towns they had left behind. Every story carried a warning, yet an invitation, a promise that if they stayed, they would see life differently than they ever had before. The women felt the weight of the isolation. Out here, beyond the rivers and hills, the world seemed both vast and intimate. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind, became a part of the story unfolding around them. They shared glances, silently acknowledging a mixture of fear and fascination. The rancher noticed, of course. He had lived long enough to read people like open books, to see hesitation and desire dancing together in nervous hands and shifting eyes. But he spoke little of it, allowing the tension to grow, allowing the silence to speak as loudly as any words could. By the second day, life on the ranch began to feel different to the women. The chores were hard, the sun unforgiving, and yet there was a rhythm that felt oddly comforting. The rancher continued his quiet watch, offering help only when necessary. In each small gesture, the handing of a cup of water, the correction of a saddle, the pointing out of a safe path across the rocky hills felt loaded with meaning. They had been warned that the West could be cruel. But there was something raw and honest about this place. Something that made them pause and reconsider the lives they had left behind. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon on the third night, an unexpected storm swept across the plains. Lightning split the sky and rain fell in sheets, turning the dry dirt into mud that clung to boots and skirts alike. The women huddled inside the ranch house, hearts pounding as thunder rolled across the hills. The rancher moved among them calmly, gathering blankets, starting a fire, offering what comfort he could without a word more than necessary. There was an energy in the room that none of them could name, a mix of danger, excitement, and the unspoken question of what would happen once the storm passed. It was then that the first strange thing happened. A sound, faint but distinct, came from outside the walls. Hoofbeats, not from their horses, but from somewhere unknown. The rancher's hand tightened on the edge of the wooden table. His eyes flicked to the window, then back to the women, who watched him silently. Sensing that something important had shifted, the storm raged on, but the tension in the room was sharper than the lightning itself. No one spoke, but all felt the unspoken truth. The arrival of something or someone was imminent, and it would change everything. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean. The air sharp and sweet, the women emerged, mud on their shoes and clothes, but hearts still pounding from the previous night. The rancher was already outside, checking the fences, scanning the horizon as though expecting a visitor. When he saw them, there was a brief nod, an acknowledgement that something had begun, a story that none of them could yet understand. They tried to smile, to brush off the unease, but the feeling lingered. Out here, on the wide, untamed plains, the ordinary rules of the world seemed to shift, and every glance, every gesture, carried a weight that could not be ignored. And so, the ranch stood in silence, waiting. The women knew that their journey had led them here for a reason, and that the lone rancher, mysterious and untouchable as he seemed, held the key to the next chapter. They could sense it in the way he moved, the way he watched, the way the wind carried his voice across the fields. Something was coming, something that would test their courage, their trust, and their understanding of this harsh, beautiful land. The sun rose higher, glinting off the weathered boards and fences, and the stage was set for a story none of them would soon forget. The air was thick with possibility and danger, and as the women glanced at the rancher, they realized with a sudden, quiet fear that they were no longer mere travelers. They were part of something larger, something unknown. And the next moment when it came would reveal whether they could survive the mysteries of the lone ranch, or whether the land itself would swallow them into its endless horizon. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth and wild grasses. The women worked quietly, each step cautious, as though the land itself demanded respect. They had begun to understand that life on the ranch was not just about chores and cattle. It was about learning a rhythm, balance between the harshness of the frontier and the quiet patience it required. The rancher moved among them, observing more than guiding, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with purpose, often revealing little and leaving much to the imagination. Over breakfast, the women exchanged glances, trying to piece together the man behind the stoic exterior. He had come to the ranch as a boy, they learned from one careful word. Taking over the land after the previous owner had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, he had lived in solitude ever since, raising the cattle, repairing fences, and surviving the unforgiving winters that seemed to settle over the plains like a permanent weight. The women were both impressed and wary. This was a man who had carved his life from the raw land itself, yet there was an edge to him that spoke of secrets and unspoken danger. During the day, the work was relentless. The ranch stretched for miles, and the chores never ended. They fed the animals, mended broken fence posts, and learned to handle the rough terrain with care. Every now and then, the rancher would disappear over a hill or into a grove of trees, only to return with a quiet efficiency that left the women both exhausted and uneasy. They whispered among themselves about his past, speculating on the reasons for his isolation, yet each theory felt inadequate. There was something about him that refused to be neatly categorized, a man shaped by both hardship and choice, whose life carried an aura of mystery the frontier itself could not conceal. By midday, the sun had climbed high, baking the dust into a fine golden powder that clung to skin and clothes. One of the women, the eldest and perhaps the most cautious, tried to make small talk, asking about the land and its history. The rancher's response was slow, deliberate, almost as if he weighed each word before letting it pass his lips. He spoke of settlers who had tried and failed, of storms that had claimed both men and animals, of nights when the plains seemed alive with voices carried by the wind. His stories hinted at events the women could not fully grasp, moments of fear, loss, and resilience woven into the very soil beneath their feet. As the day wore on, a sense of unease began to grow. The women noticed small signs of disturbance, a fence torn in one corner, hoofprints that didn't match their horses, the distant sound of voices that vanished when they strained to listen. The rancher paid little attention outwardly. The way his hands tightened around a tool or how his eyes scanned the horizon suggested he was aware of something they could not see. The mystery deepened with each passing hour, and the women felt themselves drawn into it, both fascinated and unsettled by the power of the land and the man who had mastered it. Late in the afternoon, the sky darkened once more, though no storm was yet brewing. The clouds rolled low, casting long shadows across the ranch and stretching the buildings into eerie silhouettes. The rancher moved quickly, checking each fence line in the barn, his movements precise, almost urgent. The women followed cautiously, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. One of them dared to ask if there had been trouble before, if the ranch had been threatened by outsiders. The rancher stopped, his gaze fixed on the horizon, and said only, "This land has a way of testing those who step onto it. You'll see soon enough." There was no malice in his tone, only a calm acknowledgement of a truth the women could not yet comprehend. As evening approached, the rancher gathered the women near the main house. He handed each of them a lantern, explaining that the night on the plains could be dangerous and that shadows often hid more than they revealed. The women noticed the steady hand he kept on each lantern, the way he moved to block the light from falling on certain areas, and they understood without words that they were not merely guests. Here they were participants in something larger than themselves. Each glanced toward the distant hills. Each movement of the wind through the trees seemed to carry a message, a silent warning they were only beginning to interpret. Night fell, and the ranch took on a different character. The wind whispered against the walls, carrying the distant howl of wolves or coyotes, sounds that made the women tense and cling closer together. The rancher sat near the fire, sharpening tools and checking equipment with a meticulous attention to detail. Occasionally he glanced up, eyes catching the flicker of lantern light or the shadows dancing across the walls. His silence was purposeful, an unspoken test of awareness, patience, and courage. The women realized that surviving here would require more than physical strength. It would demand observation, intuition, and trust, qualities they were only beginning to discover in themselves. A sudden movement outside drew their attention. The lanterns trembled in their hands as they strained to see what had caused it. The rancher rose slowly, placing a steadying hand on one of the women's shoulders. He stepped toward the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there at first glance, only the wind carrying branches against each other, yet his expression was serious. "Not everything shows itself at once," he said quietly. "Some things wait for the right moment." The words sent a shiver down their spines, hinting at dangers that lurked unseen. Waiting for a chance to make themselves known, the storm that had passed days before had left small pools of water reflecting the moonlight, giving the ranch an otherworldly glow. The women walked cautiously outside, feeling the wet earth beneath their boots, and noticed tracks leading toward the hills. They followed silently, hearts pounding, unsure of what they hoped to find. The rancher remained nearby, but did not speak, letting them discover the landscape while maintaining a watchful presence. Each footprint in the mud, each snapped twig, seemed to add another layer to the mystery surrounding the ranch and its enigmatic owner. Over the next few days, the rhythm of ranch life settled into a pattern. though the tension never fully dissipated. The women began to notice details they had overlooked before, the way the rancher's eyes lingered on certain areas, the subtle signs of animals reacting to unseen presences, and the strange alignment of objects that seemed purposeful rather than random. Small discoveries in an old journal tucked behind a beam, a collection of tools arranged with precision, a worn photograph of a previous inhabitant hinted at histories that the rancher did not volunteered but allowed them to piece together slowly. Each revelation brought new questions, drawing them deeper into the mysteries of the land and the man who ruled it with quiet authority. One night, as they sat around the fire, the rancher finally spoke more freely, recounting a tale of the early settlers who had arrived decades ago. He told of courage, betrayal, and survival, of families torn apart by storms and harsh winters, of alliances forged and broken in the endless struggle with the land itself. The women listened intently, realizing that his stories were more than entertainment, they were lessons, maps of experience meant to prepare them for challenges that had yet to appear. There was a gravity to his voice that commanded respect, a weight of truth that made the night feel alive with history and unspoken threats. Even as they absorbed these tales, the ranch itself seemed to respond. Doors would creak as if touched by unseen hands. The wind carried voices too faint to understand. In the shadows cast by lantern, light twisted and shifted in ways that made it difficult to distinguish reality from imagination. The women began to sense that the rancher's life and the land's mysteries were intertwined, that his presence alone was part of the landscape's power. Every step they took, every sound they heard, felt connected to a larger story, a web of events that had started long before their arrival and would continue long after. By the end of the week, the women had grown stronger and more attuned to the land, but the sense of suspense remained. They were no longer strangers. They were participants in a delicate balance between man, land, and the unknown. The rancher's influence was subtle, but unmistakable his actions. Words and even silences shaped the world around them in ways they were only beginning to understand. And still, questions lingered. Who had truly come before them? What dangers were hidden in the hills and valleys? And what truths would reveal themselves only when the right moment arrived? The nights on the ranch were long and filled, shadows that seemed alive. And as the women lay awake, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the distant call of animals, they realized that they were part of a story much larger than themselves. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of moonlight, every whisper of wind was a signal, a hint at the mysteries that awaited. The rancher remained a figure both protective and unknowable, a man whose presence promised guidance and challenge in equal measure. And as the moon climbed high over the plains, the sense of suspense deepened, leaving the man and the audience wondering what the next sunrise would bring. The morning sun rose weakly over the horizon, casting pale light across the ranch and glinting off the dew-soaked grasses. The women moved through their chores quietly, the tension from the previous night still clinging to their nerves. Even the animals seemed restless, shifting uneasily in their pens and letting out low, uncertain sounds. The rancher watched them from a distance, his posture tense, yet composed, as though he was reading the land the same way he read people. There was a sense that the events of the day would not be ordinary, that something was approaching which would test all of them in ways they could not yet foresee. It began with a visitor or perhaps an intruder, though no one could tell for certain which. Tracks appeared near the edge of the property, muddy prints that didn't match any of the horses or boots on the ranch. The rancher knelt to inspect them, his brow furrowed, and gestured for the women to stay back. His eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon, tracing the path of the footprints that led toward the hills. The women felt a chill rise along their spines, the unease from previous days growing sharper. This was a land of sudden threats, they realized. And the stories the rancher had told were not merely history, they were warnings. One of the younger women, always eager to prove herself, wanted to investigate the tracks, to see if they could follow them and understand what had passed through. The rancher's response was firm but measured. Some paths are meant to be watched from a distance. Patience is the first lesson out here. His tone carried weight, a mixture of authority and caution, and the woman's excitement faded into reluctant compliance. The other women shared glances, understanding that life on the ranch demanded restraint and observation as much as effort. Each of them was learning to read not just the land but the quiet signals of the rancher himself. By afternoon, the tension had grown almost unbearable. The wind picked up, carrying strange noises from the hills and rustling the leaves in patterns that made shadows seem alive. A small argument broke out among the women over how to handle the situation, their voices tight with worry and frustration. The rancher intervened, calm but unmistakably commanding, guiding them back to focus on the immediate tasks while keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter. His presence alone seemed to channel their nervous energy, shaping their panic into action. Though the undercurrent of fear remained, while the women worked, the rancher moved silently across the land, checking fences and corners of the property that might provide access to intruders. He carried a rifle but did not raise it unnecessarily, a signal that his power lay as much in patience and strategy as in force. He paused at the edge of a shallow ravine, studying a series of broken branches and disturbed dirt. The subtle signs spoke to him. Clearly someone or something had been there recently. He muttered under his breath, the words indistinct but heavy with intent, and moved on without a sound, leaving the women to wonder what knowledge he carried that he had yet to share. As evening approached, the rancher gathered the women near the barn, the air thick with unease. He told them stories of past conflicts, encounters with outlaws, disputes over land boundaries, and cattle rustlers who had vanished into the hills before the law could touch them. The stories were warnings and lessons, designed to prepare the women for the challenges of frontier life, though each carried a tension that made their hearts race. Even as they listened, shadows danced around the barn, and every distant sound seemed amplified, turning the night into a stage for unseen threats. Meanwhile, small subplots began to emerge among the women themselves. The youngest found herself drawn to the land, fascinated by the quiet discipline of the rancher and the subtle ways he communicated without words. She began to shadow him, learning the rhythm of the work and observing his interactions with the animals. The eldest, however, was consumed by worry for their safety, questioning every decision and constantly scanning the horizon for danger. Another woman, quiet and reflective, kept a journal, recording both the beauty and the fear she felt, attempting to impose order on the chaos of emotion that the ranch and its mysteries stirred within her. These different perspectives created tension and dynamic among them, each approach a reflection of their own fears and strengths. Night arrived once more, bringing with it an almost tangible sense of anticipation. The women could hear the distant hills creaking with the weight of the wind and imagined figures moving in the darkness. The rancher lit a lantern and walked along the fence line, his figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the moonlight. The women followed at a cautious distance, each step deliberate and careful, aware that the land could be unforgiving. They shared nervous glances, but dared not speak too loudly, aware that the rancher's silence often carried more meaning than words could convey. Suddenly, a noise shattered the tense calm, a low, guttural growl from the edge of the property. The horses whinnied in fear, and the women froze. The rancher moved instantly, positioning himself between the source of the noise and the women. His rifle ready, though his expression remained calm, he listened for a long moment, the shadows around him shifting with the moonlight, and then lowered the weapon, muttering a warning about predators and the need for vigilance. Though the threat was small, the incident heightened the sense of suspense. It was a reminder that the frontier was alive, and that danger could emerge at any moment, demanding courage, awareness, and quick thinking. The next morning brought further signs that the ranch was not as isolated as it seemed. The women discovered more tracks, some too large to belong to any animal they knew, others oddly human but unfamiliar. The rancher studied each carefully, showing the women what to look for, teaching them to interpret the subtle clues in the soil and foliage. They learned about wind direction, about how animals reacted to unseen movement, and about the patterns that suggested whether intruders were friend or foe. Each discovery added depth to the conflict, revealing that the ranch was part of a larger world of tension, one they had only begun to understand. Tensions among the women themselves began to surface more sharply. Fear and frustration created small arguments. Differing opinions about how to handle the growing mystery threatened to split their unity. One wanted to leave the ranch immediately, convinced that the land held more danger than they could face. Another insisted on staying, drawn by curiosity and the desire to prove herself capable. The rancher observed without intervening at first, allowing the women to navigate their own conflicts. Though his occasional guidance reminded them that survival depended on trust, collaboration, and careful judgment. Meanwhile, the land seemed to respond to their presence. Strange noises echoed from the hills, animals behaved unpredictably, and the weather shifted unexpectedly, casting sudden storms and heavy winds across the plains. Each incident tested the women's courage, patience, and ability to work together under pressure. The rancher remained a steady anchor, his knowledge of the terrain and its hidden dangers a lifeline. Though the deeper mysteries of his past and the ranch's history remained unresolved by the end of the week. The main conflict had expanded beyond simple survival. The women were not just facing the unknown, whether it was intruders, predators, or the harsh land itself, but also the challenge of understanding the rancher, his rules, and the lessons he imparted. Subplots intertwined with the main tension, the bond forming among the women. The subtle lessons in observation and patience, and the questions that haunted each of them about the history and secrets of the ranch, each day built upon the last, layering suspense and anticipation, creating a sense that something monumental was on the horizon, though what it would be remained unclear. As the sun set, once again, casting long shadows over the ranch, the women gathered near the fire, their faces marked by both exhaustion and determination. The rancher stood silently behind them, his gaze on the distant hills where the tracks had led. The wind carried the scent of rain yet to come, and the plains seemed to hold their breath. Everyone knew that the events of the following days could change everything, yet no one could predict the form that the next challenge would take. The air was thick with suspense, the tension of unanswered questions, and the weight of lives intertwined with the land and its mysterious guardian in the stillness of the night. The ranch seemed almost alive, whispering secrets through the rustle of trees, the creak of fences, and the distant cries of animals. The women felt the pull of curiosity, fear, and the unknown all at once. They were no longer merely visitors. They had become part of the ranch's story, caught between the demands of the land, the enigma of the rancher, and the unresolved dangers that seemed to hover just beyond sight. And as the moon climbed higher, casting silver light across the plains, it became clear that the conflict, both external and internal, was far from over. Every sound, every shadow, and every glance carried significance. And the next moment could shift everything they thought they knew about the frontier, the ranch, and the secrets hidden within its borders. The sky darkened long before sunset, the clouds rolling in heavy and low, casting the ranch in a dull, gray light that made every shadow seem sharper. The women moved quickly among the animals, hastening chores with a sense of urgency they could not explain. Even the rancher, normally unshakable, carried a tension in his stance, subtle tightness in his hands as he checked fences and gates. The land itself seemed alive with anticipation, each gust of wind and distant caw of a crow amplifying the unease that had been building for days. By mid-afternoon, strange tracks appeared again, more pronounced this time, cutting through the mud with a confidence that suggested a visitor who knew the terrain well. The rancher knelt and examined them carefully, his eyes sharp and calculating. "They're close," he muttered, mostly to himself, though the women heard and stiffened. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal felt magnified, each one carrying a potential threat. The air seemed charged, as if the plains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to arrive. The women tried to stay focused, performing their chores with diligence, but the weight of suspense made concentration difficult. The youngest, drawn by curiosity and the need to act, kept glancing toward the hills, imagining figures moving through the foggy distance. The eldest tried to maintain calm, insisting that patience and observation were the best weapons. while the quietest one recorded each moment in her journal, hoping that noting the details might create a sense of control over the growing tension. The rancher, meanwhile, moved with precision, appearing suddenly at their sides. Guiding without interrupting, always aware of dangers they could neither see nor predict, as evening approached, the sky erupted with sudden flashes of lightning, followed by the low rumble of thunder that shook the distant hills. The storm seemed to move unnaturally fast, sweeping across the plains in waves of wind and rain that made every fence post and tree sway violently. The rancher ushered the women into the main house, their lanterns flickering as the wind rattled the doors and windows. Every shadow cast by the dancing flames seemed alive, every creak and groan of the old building a warning. The storm carried an almost supernatural intensity, forcing everyone inside to acknowledge the vulnerability of the land and their small place within it. The rancher spoke little, moving with efficiency as he secured the animals and checked the gates. His eyes flicked repeatedly toward the windows, sharp and watchful. The women huddled together, nerves fraying under the tension, sensing the storm. Mirrored the uncertainty that had been building between the tracks, the intrusions, and the mysteries of the ranch itself. There was an unspoken understanding that the next few hours would test them in ways that could change everything. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated through the house, and the lanterns swung violently, casting enormous shadows across the walls. The women screamed, clutching each other as the rancher moved swiftly, rifle in hand, toward the noise. He disappeared from view for a moment, then returned with an intense look, signaling that everyone should remain quiet and stay close. Youngest woman's heart pounded as she tried to follow his movements, feeling both fear and a thrill she could not name. The rancher's calm, controlled demeanor amid chaos reinforced the idea that he alone seemed able to read the land and the dangers that came with it. Outside, the storm had intensified, the wind tearing at fences and sending debris skittering across the property. The mysterious tracks now seemed more urgent, leading in patterns that suggested movement around the ranch, circling closer and closer. The women peered through the windows, hearts racing, catching glimpses of indistinct shapes in the distance. Figures that could be intruders, animals, or something else entirely. Each movement set their imagination ablaze, fear and curiosity combining to make the night feel almost unreal. The rancher gathered the women into a tight circle, explaining the plan in low, deliberate tones. He spoke of signals, listening for sounds, observing the way shadows shifted, and responding quickly but cautiously. Every word carried weight. Each instruction seemed critical. The women absorbed it all. Realizing that survival on this land required more than strength, it required awareness, intuition, and trust in the man who had mastered it. Their respect for him deepened even as their anxiety grew, knowing that the next moment could bring the culmination of all the suspense that had been building over the past week. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Pounded the roof, wind shrieked through the trees, and the distant hills seemed to move in the storm's eerie light. The women sat tense and silent, listening for the slightest indication of what might come. The rancher occasionally peeked through windows, his eyes scanning the darkness, his body rigid with readiness. Every sound, hoofbeats, snapping branches, the faint scrape of something heavy made their hearts jump. They were acutely aware that the storm had not just washed the land, it had brought the unknown closer, magnifying the danger that had hovered unseen until now. Amid the storm, relationships among the women deepened in subtle ways. The eldest woman, usually cautious, began to see the bravery in the youngest, recognizing how curiosity and instinct could be as valuable as caution. The quietest woman, whose journal had been a source of focus, noticed how attention to detail might tip the balance between safety and disaster. The dynamic among them shifted, bonded by shared fear and the need for teamwork. Yet still tinged with tension, each woman wondering if they could truly trust the others under pressure. The rancher's presence held them together, a guiding force they could not fully understand, yet could not ignore. Lightning illuminated the distant hills once more, and in that brief, stark light, shapes moved unmistakably among the shadows. The women gasped, clutching each other as the rancher aimed his rifle toward the forms, his body tense, ready to act. The storm and darkness combined to make it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe, and the suspense reached a peak. The tracks, the intrusions, the storm, they all converged into a single, terrifying possibility that what had been, building over the past days, was about to arrive in full force. As the wind screamed and the rain lashed the house, the rancher made a sudden, sharp gesture, signaling that the women should move closer to the center of the room. The shapes outside seemed to hesitate, as if aware of his presence, and for a moment the world was suspended between action and inaction. Every heartbeat in the room was loud and deliberate. The women felt the intensity of the moment press down on them. Realizing that nothing in their past lives had prepared them for this kind of tension, where danger and uncertainty were tangible and immediate. The storm passed briefly, leaving an eerie silence that seemed almost unnatural. The shapes on the hills did not move, but the sense of their presence was undeniable. The rancher's eyes narrowed, reading the signals of the land and the unknown. Intruders with a focus that made the women hold their breath. Each flicker of shadow across the walls, each distant crack of wood, each whisper of wind became a harbinger of what was coming. The suspense had reached its peak, and the audience watching through the women's experiences would feel the same prickling anticipation of the unknown. Then, a distant shout broke the silence, sharp and urgent, carried on the wind. The women flinched, the youngest almost losing her footing, while the rancher moved instantly toward the window, scanning for the source. The shapes on the hills shifted, moving closer, their intentions still unclear but undeniably real. The storm's aftermath, the tracks, and the strange noises had all been building to this moment, a confrontation that could change everything. Fear, curiosity, and determination collided in the room, leaving the women and the rancher poised on the edge of action. No one spoke for long moments, the tension stretching unbearably. The storm had passed, but the sense of danger remained, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The rancher signaled again, this time toward the door, indicating a need to prepare for what was coming. The women obeyed, their movements precise, despite the adrenaline surging through them. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, every distant shape in the hills reminded them that the climax was near, but its form, its consequences were still unknown. The ranch, usually a place of hard work and quiet routine, had transformed into a stage for the ultimate test. Every decision, every glance, every action mattered. The women had learned lessons of observation, trust, and patience. Yet even these were not enough to remove the fear that gripped them. The rancher remained the calm center, but even he could not predict exactly how the approaching events would unfold. The suspense was total, the tension at its peak, and the audience could feel that the resolution, the confrontation, the revelation, the truth was imminent. Just beyond the horizon, the wind swept across the plains once more, carrying the faint sounds of movement from the hills. The women gathered close, lanterns flickering, hearts racing. The rancher's silhouette stood firm against the window light, rifle at the ready, eyes fixed on the shadows. Every element of the ranch, the land, the storm, the tracks, the unknown shapes combined to create a moment that demanded courage, clarity, and instinct. The climax of the story was building, and every second stretched the suspense higher. Leaving everyone waiting, wondering, and unable to predict what would happen next, the wind finally began to die down, leaving a heavy, expectant silence over the ranch. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered. Branches were broken. Puddles glimmered in the moonlight, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth. The women stayed close together, hearts still racing from the tension of the night. While the rancher moved deliberately through the yard, inspecting fences and gates, his presence had been a steady anchor during the suspense, and now, in the quiet that followed, it carried a different weight, a sense of calm that reassured them without words. The first sign of resolution came when the distant shapes on the hills revealed themselves to be nothing more than travelers seeking shelter. They had been lost, disoriented by the storm and confused by the uneven terrain. Their movements interpreted as threatening only because of the tension in the air. The rancher approached them cautiously, his rifle lowered but his posture alert, guiding them to the safety of the barn. The women followed, watching closely as the mystery unraveled before them. Relief washed over them, but the experience had left a mark. A reminder of how quickly fear could escalate and how carefully it needed to be managed in the unpredictable life of the frontier. Once the travelers were settled and the animals accounted for, the rancher gathered the women inside the main house. They sat near the fire, dripping wet but safe, the warmth slowly restoring their spirits. The rancher spoke in his low, deliberate voice, recounting the sequence of events and explaining the subtle signs they had missed, the tracks, shadows, the changes in animal behavior. He showed them how attention to detail, patience, and calm observation could make the difference between fear and understanding. The women absorbed his words, realizing that the lesson went beyond survival. It was about reading the world around them, trusting instincts, and respecting the land. The storm had also brought clarity to their own relationships. The youngest woman, who had acted impulsively at first, now understood the value of restraint and observation. She had seen how her curiosity could be guided into practical action, and she felt a newfound confidence in her abilities. The eldest woman, once overly cautious, learned to balance her worry with trust. Realizing that courage sometimes required stepping back and letting others lead. The quietest, reflective woman's journal had become a tool for reflection and strategy, helping everyone make sense of the chaos and fear. Each woman emerged stronger, their individual growth intertwined with the trials they had faced on the ranch in the days that followed. The ranch returned to its routine. The fences were repaired, the cattle tended, and the land slowly regained its normal rhythm. The women moved with more confidence, each step carrying a sense of understanding born from the previous week's events. The rancher, usually silent and reserved, began to share more stories of the land, of past challenges and triumphs, giving the women insight into both his life and the history of the frontier. These stories helped them feel connected to the land in a deeper way, reinforcing the lessons of vigilance, patience, and respect that had been woven throughout their experience. The travelers, who had caused the panic, became part of the story rather than a source of threat. They shared their own experiences, recounting how the storm had left them lost and frightened. The women listened, realizing that danger often came not just from malicious forces but from the unpredictability of nature itself. The interaction strengthened the sense of community on the ranch, reminding everyone that cooperation and understanding were as vital as individual skill and bravery. The land was vast and untamed, but with awareness and collaboration, it could be navigated safely. Over time, small celebrations emerged to mark their survival and growth. Meals were shared, laughter returned to the house, and moments of quiet reflection allowed the women to process all that had occurred. They realized that the rancher's lessons were not simply about handling emergencies. They were about living fully in a world that was beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Observing the horizon, feeling the wind across the plains, and listening to the subtle signals of the land became part of their daily lives, a new rhythm that tied them to the ranch and its mysteries. The women also discovered hidden strengths within themselves. The youngest, once hesitant and fearful, found a sense of leadership emerging, often taking initiative in tasks that required quick thinking. The eldest embraced a role of guidance and protection, balancing her caution with insight and empathy. The reflective woman continued to record every detail, but now with a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival, she had become the chronicler of lessons learned, ensuring that the experiences would not be forgotten. Each subplot had come full circle, merging personal growth with the shared experience of navigating suspense, danger, and uncertainty. The rancher, observing the changes in the women, allowed a rare smile to touch his face. He had tested them in small ways, watched how they responded to fear and responsibility, and now he could see the results. The land itself seemed to respond, the air lighter, the animals calmer, the fences straight and sturdy. It was a subtle victory, one that did not require dramatic action or confrontation, but instead relied on understanding, vigilance, and respect. The suspense of the past week had reached its resolution not through violence or chaos, but through patience, courage, and connection to the world around them. As the sun set over the plains, casting long golden light across the property, the women gathered outside. The rancher joined them, standing tall as the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and fresh earth. They looked out over the land, realizing that the lessons they had learned extended far beyond the ranch itself. They had discovered how to navigate fear, interpret subtle signs, work together, and trust both themselves and others. The plains stretched endlessly before them, a symbol of opportunity, challenge, and the vast unknown. Yet they no longer felt small or powerless in its presence. Night fell slowly, quiet and calm after the storm. The women lit lamps inside the house, finishing their journals and tidying their spaces. The rancher moved through the rooms, checking each one briefly before returning to the main hall. The sense of suspense that had gripped them for so long had transformed into something steadier, a shared awareness of the land, its rhythms, and the importance of preparation and insight. The ranch had become more than a place to survive. It was now a classroom, a testing ground, and a home shaped by both challenge and growth. By the end of the week, the women had fully adapted to life on the ranch. Their confidence had grown, their trust in the rancher strengthened, and their awareness of the frontier sharpened. Even small tasks, feeding the animals, repairing fences, observing weather patterns carried meaning, each action a reinforcement of the lessons they had learned during the storm and the days of suspense that followed. They knew that the land would continue to present challenges, but they also knew they had the skills, awareness, and resilience to meet them. The story closed on a note of reflection. The women had come seeking work, opportunity, or adventure, but they had found something far deeper: understanding of themselves, insight into the complexities of the frontier, and a connection to a man whose quiet authority and knowledge had guided them through the most tense and mysterious moments of their journey. The suspense, the fear, and the mysteries of the land had shaped them in ways they could not have anticipated, leaving lessons that would endure long after they left the ranch. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, the rancher and the women stood together outside, looking toward the horizon. There were no more intruders, no threatening tracks. It was only the quiet power of the plains and the satisfaction of challenges met and understood. The land stretched endlessly before them, reminding them that life on the frontier would always hold the unexpected. But that courage, patience, and awareness were their most reliable companions. The women shared smiles, small but genuine, feeling the bond between themselves and the rancher, and between themselves and the land they had learned to navigate. The quiet of the night was profound, yet comforting. The wind whispered softly through the trees, the animals rested peacefully, and the lanterns glowed steadily inside the house. The story had reached its natural conclusion, not with sudden resolution or dramatic confrontation, but with the steady, meaningful understanding that had been building since their arrival. The suspense had been resolved through knowledge, trust, and courage, leaving the women and the audience with a sense of fulfillment, growth, and connection to the land. In the end, the ranch stood firm, the women prepared for whatever the future might bring, and the lone rancher remained a steady guide, silent but present. The storm, the tracks, the mysterious shape Saul had played their part in shaping the experience. Yet now the land felt calm and safe. Life would continue, filled with both challenge and beauty, and the lessons learned in suspense, patience, and observation would carry forward. The horizon stretched endlessly, full of possibility, and the women felt ready to face it. Knowing that the land and its keeper had prepared them for the world beyond the ranch, the night deepened, stars shimmering over the plains, and the women, once travelers seeking opportunity, now felt a sense of belonging and understanding. The rancher's presence, the lessons of the land, and the shared experiences of suspense and danger had changed them. They had grown, bonded, and discovered resilience within themselves. The story ended not with an abrupt resolution, but with a calm, natural sense of closure, each question answered, each subplot concluded, and each character poised for the life that stretched ahead. Guided by the lessons of the frontier and the enduring strength of the ranch itself,